The sun was already high in the sky, scorching the earth with its relentless heat, when Jed McCall rode slowly across his ranch. Dust rose in thin waves from the ground beneath his horse's hooves, catching the golden light and shimmering like tiny sparks in the air. He had spent decades on this land, tending to his cattle, mending fences, and making sure the property he had inherited from his father remained a thriving place of work and life. Every ridge, every dip in the rolling plains was familiar to him. He knew where the grass grew thickest, where the water holes never ran dry, and where predators often lurked at night. Jed was a man of few words, the kind of person who let his work speak for him. His face was weathered, deeply tanned by years under the sun, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that told the story of a life spent outdoors, battling the elements and facing whatever challenges came with living on the edge of civilization. His hands, rough and calloused, were proof of a life filled with labor. Yet they also held a careful gentleness when he brushed a calf or coaxed a stubborn horse into line. Despite the harshness of the land and the demands of his work, there was a sense of quiet pride in Jed. He had built a life for himself that few could imagine surviving, let alone thriving in. That morning, as he rode along the fence line, he felt the heat pressing down on him through his wide-brimmed hat. Sweat ran in thin streaks down his face and into his eyes, making him squint against the glare of the sun. The ranch was alive with movement, cattle milling in the fields, horses flicking their tails against flies, and the distant cry of a hawk echoing across the plains. It was a familiar scene, one that had become almost meditative in its predictability. Still, even in its calmness, life on the ranch demanded attention, focus, and energy. A single mistake, an overlooked fence post, a sick calf, or a loose gate, could lead to disaster. Jed guided his horse to the small stream that cut across the eastern edge of the property. The water was clear and cool, a rare luxury in the middle of the day, and he paused to let his horse drink before tying it loosely to a nearby post. He knelt by the edge, cupping the water in his rough hands to splash across his face, feeling a momentary relief from the heat. The ranch stretched endlessly around him, golden fields dotted with grazing cattle, clusters of cottonwood trees providing sparse shade, and beyond them, the distant rise of hills that marked the border of his property. It was a land that demanded respect, one that gave little to those who failed to understand its rhythms. Yet Jed had long since learned how to move in harmony with it. As he stood brushing the dirt from his trousers, a faint sound carried on the wind, a distant clatter of hooves and the murmur of voices. At first he thought it was one of his neighboring ranchers making their usual rounds, but the sound was lighter, more hurried, carrying a hint of excitement that made Jed pause. Curiosity stirred inside him. He had heard rumors, whispers that sometimes reached even the most remote corners of the plains, about travelers, shows, and spectacles that moved from town to town, bringing news, entertainment, and challenges for anyone willing to test their courage. The thought intrigued him, though he would never have admitted it aloud to anyone. Jed continued his ride toward the town, moving steadily along a narrow dirt road that wound through the plains. Along the way, he passed familiar landmarks, an old windmill creaking in the breeze, a weathered barn leaning slightly with age, and the remnants of a stone wall that had once kept predators at bay. Each step reminded him of the years of labor it had taken to keep the ranch alive. He thought about his father, who had taught him to ride before he could even walk properly, to respect the land and to value hard work above all else. Those lessons had stayed with him, shaping the man he had become. By mid-morning, the town came into view, a small cluster of buildings huddled together, as if for protection against the vast openness around them. Wooden sidewalks lined the main street, and the scent of fresh bread and horse sweat mingled in the air. Jed dismounted, tying his horse outside the general store, and took a few steps onto the creaking boards of the walkway. The town had a quiet energy, the kind that made it feel alive despite its small size. Children ran barefoot across the street, laughing as they chased each other, while merchants called out from their shops, advertising goods and gossip alike. It was there, among the townsfolk, that Jed first heard the talk of the traveling show. The words came in fragments carried by the wind of excitement, a daring challenge, a spectacle to test courage, a chance to show one's mettle before a crowd. Some spoke with admiration, others with skepticism, but all agreed that it was not for the faint of heart. Jed listened quietly, leaning against the post of a shop front, his mind turning over what he heard. Something about the idea stirred a mixture of apprehension and intrigue within him. He had spent his life facing challenges of the land, of weather, of cattle and predators. But this was different. This was a test of courage in a public way, something that demanded exposure not just to danger, but to judgment to the eyes of strangers. For a long moment, Jed just watched the people moving about their day, considering the choice before him. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the rooftops and dust-swept streets. Yet he felt a strange pull toward the excitement. It was a call to step outside the rhythms of his familiar life, to confront something unknown. His hand brushed the brim of his hat, shielding his eyes from the glare, and he took a deep breath of the hot, dry air. There was a stirring in his chest, a quiet challenge that whispered he might just be ready to answer. Even as he considered it, Jed remained calm outwardly, though inside a storm of thoughts swirled. He remembered times when he had faced the unpredictable, storms that threatened to wash away his fences, a calf lost to illness, or a wild horse that refused to be tamed. Each of those moments had required patience, resilience, and courage, but never had he been called upon to confront the scrutiny of a crowd, the way this challenge demanded. And yet, deep down, he knew that part of life was facing what scared you, pushing past comfort to see what you were truly capable of. The morning stretched on, and Jed wandered through the town, observing people preparing for the event. He noticed the careful arrangements of wooden platforms and ropes, the small stage being built for those who would participate. Excitement hummed in the air, and he could see the tension and anticipation mirrored in the faces of those around him. Every detail was a reminder that this was no ordinary day, no ordinary test, but an event that promised both danger and revelation. Jed's curiosity grew stronger, mingled with a strange nervous energy that made his pulse quicken. As he walked, he found himself thinking about the stories his father used to tell him, tales of courage, skill, and integrity in the face of challenge. Those stories were not of glory or fame, but of quiet bravery, of standing firm when circumstances demanded it. Jed realized that this day might be another story to add to that collection, a test not of skill with cattle or horses, but of character, heart, and resolve. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Jed found a place near the stage, leaning against the wooden rail and observing the preparations. The crowd was gathering, their chatter a constant murmur against the wind. Performers moved about, checking their equipment, giving last-minute instructions, and preparing for the spectacle ahead. Jed's mind raced with questions, fears, and possibilities, yet beneath it all was a quiet readiness. He had lived his life in the open, confronting challenges that seemed impossible to others. This would be no different. He simply had to step forward, as he had done so many times before. And so, standing in the heat of the midday sun, Jed McCall prepared himself in silence. Around him, the town buzzed with anticipation, unaware of the quiet determination growing within the rancher who had lived his life under the endless sky. The journey of the day, the challenge to come, and the tests ahead were unknown, but Jed felt a strange calm settling over him. He had faced the unpredictability of life before, and he would face it again. The first step was always the hardest, but he was ready. Jed stood near the wooden platform, his boots digging slightly into the dusty street as he watched the bustling activity of the town unfold around him. The heat of the midday sun pressed down, making the air shimmer, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with a sleeve, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He could feel the quiet hum of anticipation in the air, the kind that makes even the most ordinary moments feel charged with energy. Children ran past, their laughter ringing out like bells, while townsfolk whispered to one another, their eyes flicking toward the platform as if trying to catch a glimpse of the excitement that was about to begin. The challenge was unlike anything Jed had ever faced. From what he had gathered, it was not a simple display of skill or strength. It was a test of courage, of willingness to confront the unknown, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, a challenge that required him to reveal a part of himself he had always kept hidden. People spoke of it in hushed tones, using words like daring, bold, and fearless, but Jed knew better. True courage was not about spectacle. It was about standing firm when every instinct begged you to step back. And now, with the sun high overhead and the crowd beginning to gather, he could feel that test pressing against him like the weight of the sky itself. Jed's eyes scanned the people preparing for the event. Some were seasoned performers, their movements confident, their expressions calm despite the heat and the expectant gaze of the crowd. Others fidgeted nervously, shifting from foot to foot, whispering reassurances to themselves or to friends who had come to support them. The platform, made of sturdy planks of oak, stood elevated above the dusty street, ropes and pulleys hanging nearby for reasons Jed could only guess at. He noted the precise way the equipment had been set up, how every detail seemed designed to maximize tension and anticipation. As he observed, Jed's thoughts wandered to the hours, days, and even years he had spent on the ranch. He thought of the times he had faced storms that tore through fences and flattened crops, of nights when he had rushed through mud and darkness to rescue a calf that had wandered into danger. Those experiences had tested his endurance, patience, and skill, but they had never demanded that he expose himself in front of a crowd, stripped of privacy and left only with his courage. The idea of it made his stomach tighten, a mix of fear and excitement swirling inside him. The townsfolk began to gather in larger numbers, their voices rising in a low, eager murmur that carried on the wind. Jed noticed how they leaned forward on the edges of buildings and fences, peering toward the platform as though the spectacle itself might teach them something about bravery, or provide a story they could retell for years. There was a strange energy in the crowd, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and judgment, and it made Jed feel the weight of their gaze even before he stepped forward. He had faced difficult tasks before, but this was different. This was not about skill or strength alone. It was about character, about how a man stood when every eye was on him. Jed took a slow, deep breath, letting the dust-filled air fill his lungs. He reminded himself that he had faced hardship before, that he had overcome challenges that seemed impossible at the time. This was just another kind of test, one that required a different kind of bravery. He could feel his pulse quicken, a steady rhythm that reminded him of the horses back at the ranch, their powerful muscles moving in sync with the earth beneath them. That rhythm was familiar, grounding, and it gave him a small measure of calm in the midst of the growing tension. Nearby, the performers went about their preparations. Some were practicing gestures, others were checking ropes, and a few paced nervously, muttering to themselves as they tried to steady their nerves. Jed observed them quietly, noting how each reacted differently to the challenge ahead. It struck him that fear could take many forms: the fear of failure, the fear of judgment, the fear of exposure. And yet even in fear there was opportunity. Even in the trembling hands of those around him, there was the chance to rise above doubt and discover what one was truly capable of. As the time drew nearer, Jed felt a strange mix of apprehension and determination. The crowd had grown larger now, spilling out from the sidewalks into the dusty street. Their voices rose and fell in excitement, creating a low, constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. He could see families standing together, children perched on crates or leaning against fences, their wide eyes fixed on the platform. Traders and shopkeepers had stepped outside their stores, taking a break from their work to witness the spectacle. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jed felt it pressing on him like a living thing, urging him to decide whether he would step forward or retreat. For a moment, he considered walking away. It would have been easy enough, returning to the safety of his ranch, to the familiar routines that required skill but not exposure. But even as that thought crossed his mind, he knew it was not who he was. Jed had never been a man to turn from challenge, no matter how daunting. He had faced storms, predators, and scarcity with unwavering determination. This was no different, save that the stakes were not measured in cattle or crops, but in courage itself. And courage, Jed realized, was often measured not in the absence of fear, but in the choice to act despite it. He stepped closer to the platform, each movement deliberate, controlled. His boots scuffed against the wooden boards, a sound that seemed loud in the charged silence of anticipation. He could feel his heart beating, strong and steady, reminding him that he was alive, that he was present, that he had a choice to make. The performers paused as he approached, their eyes flicking to him with curiosity and perhaps recognition of the quiet determination he carried. Jed's gaze remained calm, though his mind raced with possibilities of what the challenge might demand. A voice called out from the stage, announcing that the event was about to begin. The crowd's murmur rose to a steady roar of excitement, and Jed felt a wave of adrenaline wash over him. It was a feeling he knew well from long days on the ranch, from moments when he had faced unexpected danger or had to make a split-second decision. Yet now it was different. The adrenaline was mingled with fear, curiosity, and anticipation, each pulling at him in equal measure. He clenched his fists, feeling the roughness of his skin and the strength in his grip, and reminded himself that he had faced worse, that he had endured more, and that he was ready. As he mounted the platform, the crowd's eyes seemed to follow him like beams of sunlight. The heat of their gaze was tangible, pressing down on him, yet it did not weaken his resolve. Jed knew that the challenge ahead would demand every ounce of courage he possessed. He had spent his life preparing in ways that did not always feel like preparation, yet every lesson learned on the ranch, the patience, the strength, the resilience, had led him to this moment. He was ready to face what lay ahead, even if the outcome was uncertain, even if the experience would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as the performers finished their preparations, stepping back to let the challenge begin. Jed felt the wind sweep across the plains beyond the town, carrying with it a sense of vastness, freedom, and the unknown. It reminded him of his ranch, of the endless sky and the open land he had called home for so long. And in that moment, he felt a strange calm settle over him, a quiet certainty that no matter what happened, he would face it with integrity, courage, and the steady determination that had guided him all his life. Jed took one last deep breath, letting the hot air fill his lungs and steady his nerves. He glanced at the crowd, at the expectant faces, and felt the weight of their attention settle on him. Yet he did not flinch. He had faced storms, predators, and loss. He had risen before when others might have faltered. This, he realized, was simply another challenge, one that required a different kind of bravery, but bravery all the same. With a final adjustment of his hat, he prepared to step into the unknown, ready to meet whatever awaited him with steady hands, a clear mind, and a fearless heart. The wooden platform felt firmer under Jed's boots than he expected, though it creaked slightly with every subtle shift of weight. The sun had climbed even higher, baking the boards, making the heat rise from the surface in thin waves. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint tang of leather from the saddles nearby. All around him, the crowd pressed closer, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and expectation. It was an odd feeling, being observed so intensely. Jed was used to being alone with the land, with the cattle, with his thoughts. But now, every heartbeat seemed to echo in the silence of anticipation, and he felt the weight of all those gazes like a tangible pressure on his shoulders. His hands rested loosely at his sides, but he could feel the tension in them, the roughness of his palms reminding him of a lifetime spent working the ranch. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline that ran like electricity through his veins. There was no turning back now. The murmurs of the crowd were growing louder, their voices blending into a constant hum of expectation. Each murmur, each whisper seemed to reach into his mind, testing his resolve. And yet beneath the tension there was a strange clarity. Jed realized that courage was not about ignoring fear. It was about acknowledging it, feeling it, and still moving forward. As he looked out at the crowd, he could see the faces of children leaning forward on the edges of the wooden rails, wide-eyed and eager. Men and women of the town stood stiffly, whispering to one another, their brows furrowed in anticipation. Even the performers who had stepped back from the platform watched him closely, their expressions a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Jed felt a shiver run through him, not from fear but from the awareness of the moment. He was about to confront something unknown, something that required him to step beyond the ordinary measures of strength he had relied on his whole life. A voice rang out from the stage, loud and clear, announcing the beginning of the challenge. The crowd quieted slightly, the hum of expectation giving way to a tense stillness. Jed's eyes scanned the platform, noting the ropes, pulleys, and other equipment that had been arranged with precise care. The challenge itself was unclear, shrouded in mystery, and that uncertainty made it even more daunting. He could feel the tension coiling in his chest like a spring, but he did not flinch. He had faced unpredictable storms on the plains, wild cattle that refused to be tamed, and nights when danger lurked in every shadow. This was different, but it was still a challenge, and he was a man who had spent his life meeting challenges head-on. The first instructions were given. Jed listened carefully, absorbing every word, every detail. The task required him to take deliberate steps one at a time, and to remain focused no matter what sensations or emotions tried to pull him away from the task. It demanded patience, control, and courage in equal measure. Jed's mind flicked through the lessons he had learned over the years, lessons of observation, timing, and careful calculation. He understood that hesitation could be costly, that a single misstep could undermine everything, and yet the challenge was not purely physical. It tested resolve, spirit, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. He took another deep breath, feeling the sun's heat press against his back. The first movement was simple enough in description, but Jed could feel the weight of it in his body and mind. Each step forward required a balance of precision and confidence. He placed his boot carefully on the board, shifting his weight slightly, feeling the platform respond beneath him. The crowd watched in silence, sensing the tension, sensing that something important was unfolding before them. Jed was aware of every sound, the faint creak of the platform, the rustle of the wind in the nearby trees, the distant clatter of horseshoes on cobblestones. All of it combined into a symphony of anticipation that made his pulse quicken. As he continued, the challenge became increasingly demanding. Jed could feel the strain in his muscles, the tightness in his shoulders and back, but he focused on each movement, each breath. The crowd's murmurs faded into the background, replaced by the rhythm of his own heartbeat and the steady focus of his mind. This was a test not of strength alone, but of endurance, of character, of the ability to remain grounded when every instinct urged him to rush or falter. He thought of the long days on his ranch, the moments when patience had been as important as skill, and he drew strength from those memories. Sweat ran down his face, and his clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin. But Jed remained composed. Every detail mattered. The placement of his hands, the shifting of his weight, the timing of each movement. The task required him to maintain balance and poise, even as the sun beat down and the crowd's attention pressed upon him like a living force. He felt fatigue creeping into his limbs, a slow, insistent weight that tried to drag him down, but he reminded himself that he had faced exhaustion before, when the work seemed endless and the land unyielding. He could endure this too. The turning point came when the challenge demanded that he confront something deeply personal, something that went beyond physical skill. Jed realized that the task was designed not only to test his strength and patience, but to expose his vulnerabilities, to challenge his pride and sense of self. Each movement forward required him to let go of control, to embrace discomfort, and to trust in his own resilience. The crowd's gaze was intense, but Jed felt a surprising clarity. He was no longer performing for them. He was performing for himself, testing the limits of his own courage and determination. A moment came when Jed had to pause, to steady himself before taking the next step. His mind raced with thoughts, doubt, fear, anticipation, but he focused on one simple truth: he was capable. Every experience he had faced in life, from tending the cattle to repairing fences in a storm, had prepared him for this moment. He drew on that reservoir of strength, feeling it pulse through his veins, and he took the next step with deliberate care. The crowd seemed to lean forward in unison, sensing the tension and the importance of the moment. As the challenge continued, Jed's body grew weary, but his mind sharpened. He became intensely aware of every sensation: the warmth of the sun, the roughness of the platform beneath his boots, the slight sway as he shifted his weight, the distant murmur of the crowd. Each detail required his full attention, and he found a strange rhythm in the task, a steady flow that carried him forward. He realized that courage was not a single act, but a series of small, deliberate choices, each one building on the last. With each step, he felt a growing confidence, a deepening awareness that he could meet whatever challenge lay ahead. The crowd's cheers and applause began to rise and fall like waves, though Jed barely noticed. His focus was inward, on the task, on the balance between body and mind, on the calm determination that had always guided him. The turning point was not sudden. It was a slow realization that he could endure, that he could confront the fear and uncertainty, and that he could continue moving forward even when the path was unclear. It was a quiet triumph, a victory that required no fanfare but filled him with a profound sense of accomplishment. With each movement, the challenge tested him further, demanding more focus, more patience, and more courage. Jed felt the exhaustion deep in his muscles, the ache in his back and shoulders, yet he pressed on, drawing on the strength he had cultivated over a lifetime. He reminded himself that fear was natural, that uncertainty was unavoidable, and that the only way to overcome them was to face them head-on. And so he continued step by deliberate step, aware of the eyes upon him but unshaken in his resolve. As the final stages of the challenge approached, Jed felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The turning point had arrived, not as a dramatic moment but as a gradual understanding that he was capable of more than he had imagined. He felt a quiet pride, not in the spectacle itself, but in the knowledge that he had confronted fear, embraced uncertainty, and remained steadfast. It was a profound, humbling experience, one that left him exhausted yet strangely exhilarated. When the last movement was completed, Jed paused to catch his breath, feeling the weight of the task lift slightly from his shoulders. The crowd erupted into applause, but he barely heard it. His focus had shifted inward, on the realization that he had faced a challenge that demanded courage, patience, and trust in himself. He had confronted the unknown, tested his limits, and discovered a strength that was not measured by applause or recognition, but by the quiet resilience of the spirit. For a long moment, he stood on the platform, letting the warmth of the sun and the presence of the crowd wash over him. The challenge was not over in a simple sense, for its lessons would remain with him long after the applause faded. But Jed had passed the turning point. He had confronted fear, uncertainty, and the demands of courage, and emerged with a sense of calm strength and quiet triumph. As he descended from the platform, the weight of exhaustion finally settled into his body, making his limbs feel heavy and unsteady. And yet, there was also a lightness, a relief, and a sense of accomplishment that filled him in equal measure. He had faced a test unlike any other, one that went beyond physical skill and touched the very core of his character. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the dusty street and giving the wooden platform a warm, amber glow. Jed McCall stood at the edge, his boots planted firmly, though his muscles ached from the strain of the challenge he had faced. The crowd's excitement had reached a fever pitch, yet Jed was only partially aware of their cheers. His focus had narrowed to the task at hand, to the rhythm of his movements and to the unsteady beat of his own heart. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the platform beneath him, the low hum of the wind through nearby trees, and the faint shuffle of feet as townsfolk leaned closer to witness the spectacle. By this stage, the challenge had grown more intense than anything Jed had imagined. Each step, each deliberate motion required careful calculation and balance. Fatigue pressed against him like a heavy cloak, weighing down his limbs and making every movement feel more deliberate and measured. Yet, despite the exhaustion, he felt a strange clarity settle over him, a sense of purpose that came from knowing he had faced the turning point and survived. This final stage demanded more than endurance. It demanded courage that was deeper, rawer, and more personal. Jed understood now that the true test was not the physical aspect of the challenge, but the confrontation with his own limits, his own fears, and the vulnerability that came with being exposed before a crowd. The crowd's eyes followed him as he prepared for the next motion, their anticipation almost tangible in the air. Children leaned forward, eyes wide with excitement, while the adults whispered in low tones, some with admiration, others with speculation about whether he could complete the task. Jed felt the gaze of every person like a weight pressing down on him, yet he did not falter. He had spent his life facing challenges that seemed insurmountable, from storms that threatened his fences to the loss of livestock in harsh winters. Each of those experiences had tested him, honed him, and built a resilience that was now his greatest ally. As he took the next step, Jed felt a sharp awareness of his body, each muscle and joint working in harmony to maintain balance and control. His palms were sweaty, his heart raced, and yet there was a calm determination that guided his movements. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing the tension in every careful motion. The platform, the ropes, and the pulleys all demanded respect, and Jed moved with the awareness that one misstep could undo the progress he had painstakingly made. And yet there was a rhythm to it, a silent dance that required patience, focus, and courage in equal measure. Halfway through the final stage, fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. His legs trembled slightly and a dull ache spread through his shoulders and back. Sweat ran in thin lines down his face, dripping into his eyes and stinging. He paused for a brief moment, closing his eyes to steady his thoughts, and drew a deep, deliberate breath. It was not weakness that caused him to pause, but a recognition that focus must be maintained above all else. He had learned in life that rushing through difficult tasks often led to failure. Now, he reminded himself, careful patience was his greatest tool. Jed's mind flicked through the memories of his life on the ranch. The long hours spent mending fences, the nights spent tending sick calves, the storms he had weathered that had tested his endurance and resolve. Each memory provided a quiet strength, a reminder that he had faced challenges far greater than this before. This moment, as intense as it was, required the same qualities he had relied on all his life: observation, patience, courage, and the quiet faith in his own abilities. And so he pressed on, one step at a time, his body straining but his mind focused and clear. The turning point had taught him a crucial lesson. That courage was not about ignoring fear, but about embracing it and moving forward despite it. He could feel that lesson in every fiber of his being now, as the challenge demanded the very limits of his strength, balance, and focus. Every movement felt deliberate, every breath counted, and the platform seemed to shift slightly beneath him, testing his stability with each motion. Yet he did not falter. He relied on instincts honed over decades on the ranch and the steady rhythm of experience that had prepared him for moments just like this. As the climax of the challenge drew near, Jed felt an almost physical release of tension that had built throughout the day. The motions he had practiced and the careful adjustments he had made became more fluid, almost second nature. He was in a zone where fatigue and fear existed, but no longer controlled him. Every eye in the crowd was on him, yet he felt an unexpected sense of calm, a confidence that grew with every precise movement. The challenge was reaching its peak, and Jed met it with quiet determination, guided by experience, resilience, and an unwavering focus on the present moment. A sudden gust of wind swept across the street, stirring dust and loose straw into the air. It rattled the platform slightly, and for a moment Jed felt a flicker of fear. Just a flicker, not enough to shake him, but enough to remind him that the challenge demanded complete awareness. He adjusted his stance, rooted his boots firmly, and pressed forward with deliberate care. The crowd reacted to the small sway, gasping collectively, but Jed ignored them. His focus was inward, on the task, on each step, on the rhythm that had carried him through the entire ordeal. And then came the final motion, the culmination of the challenge. It was the most difficult part yet, demanding balance, precision, and courage in equal measure. Jed could feel the burn in his muscles, the ache in his joints, and the sweat clinging to his skin. His heart raced faster than ever, and his mind concentrated on nothing but the next step, the placement of his foot, the shift of his weight, and the steadying of his hands. This was the moment that would define not just the challenge, but the test of his courage, patience, and resolve. He moved carefully, deliberately, following the rhythm he had found within himself. Each step brought him closer to the platform's edge, to the completion of the task, and to the realization that he had faced fear, uncertainty, and exposure with steadfast determination. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the tension, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. Jed's muscles burned and trembled, but his mind remained clear and focused. He had faced the unknown, and he was conquering it step by step. Finally, with one last careful motion, Jed completed the final movement. A wave of relief and exhaustion swept over him, leaving him trembling slightly, yet filled with a quiet sense of triumph. The crowd erupted into applause, cheers, and exclamations of admiration, but Jed barely noticed them. His focus had shifted inward, on the knowledge that he had met the ultimate test, confronted fear, and relied on patience, strength, and courage to succeed. It was not a victory measured by applause or recognition, but by the quiet resilience of the spirit, the endurance of the mind, and the unwavering determination of the heart. He took a moment to steady his breathing, Feeling the warmth of the sun on his back and the weight of the platform beneath him, his muscles ached, sweat dripped down his face, and his clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin. But he felt lighter than he had in days. There was a strange, liberating sense that came from confronting fear directly and seeing it through to the end. He had discovered something profound. Courage was not an absence of fear, but the ability to face it, to move forward, and to trust in oneself. Jed stepped carefully off the platform, his legs shaky but steady. The cheers of the crowd swelled once more, yet he barely heard them. He was too absorbed in the realization that the challenge had changed him in a small but important way. It had tested not just his body but his mind and spirit, forcing him to confront fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability. And he had emerged on the other side with a deeper understanding of himself, of the quiet strength that comes from enduring, and of the courage required to face the unknown. The performers who had observed him approached, offering nods of respect and quiet admiration. Even the townsfolk who had watched with curiosity and excitement seemed to sense that they had witnessed more than just a spectacle. They had witnessed a man confronting himself, rising to meet a challenge that demanded every ounce of patience, focus, and courage. Jed acknowledged their gestures with a slight nod, feeling a quiet connection to the shared human experience of facing the unknown. As he walked away from the platform, the sun casting long shadows behind him, Jed felt the slow, steady return of strength to his muscles, mingled with a deep sense of satisfaction. The exhaustion remained, but it was now paired with the calm pride of accomplishment, the kind that comes from knowing you have met a challenge and emerged stronger. He had tested his limits, faced fear, and discovered a courage that was not fleeting, but enduring. A courage that would remain with him long after the applause faded. By the time Jed reached the edge of the town, the sky had turned a rich shade of orange, the sun sinking low behind distant hills. He paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the plains, the gentle sway of the tall grasses, and the warm glow that bathed the land. He felt a sense of gratitude for the life he had lived, the lessons he had learned, and the opportunity to test himself in a way that few could understand. The sun had finally disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the sky painted in shades of deep orange, pink, and purple. The town was slowly quieting down. Children were being called inside by their parents, merchants were closing their shops, and the dust in the streets began to settle after the excitement of the day. Jed McCall walked slowly through the main street, feeling the lingering fatigue in his legs and shoulders from the challenge he had faced earlier. Yet, beneath the tiredness, there was a quiet sense of fulfillment and calm, a feeling that he had not experienced in a long time. The events of the day had tested him in ways he had never imagined, and now he could feel the lasting effect of what he had endured. As Jed moved past the last of the gathering townsfolk, he could hear the occasional words of admiration, low murmurs of respect and soft applause from those who remained behind, unwilling to leave without witnessing the man who had dared to face the unknown. He did not acknowledge them with words. A simple nod sufficed. He did not need validation from others. The applause, though appreciated, was not what mattered. What mattered was the quiet understanding that he had faced a fear unlike any other, a fear that demanded vulnerability, patience, and courage, and had emerged on the other side stronger and wiser. Jed's thoughts drifted back to the ranch, to the familiar rhythms of life that awaited him there. He thought about the fences that would need mending, the cattle grazing quietly under the fading light, and the wide-open fields that stretched endlessly beneath the stars. The challenge he had faced had shown him something important, that life on the ranch, with all its routine and toil, had prepared him for moments like this, and yet the world beyond his familiar land held tests that demanded a different kind of bravery. He had learned that courage could take many forms, sometimes in quiet endurance, sometimes in bold action, and sometimes in facing vulnerability in front of others. Walking past the wooden platform where the challenge had taken place, Jed could still see the faint marks of activity, ropes slightly frayed, boards shifted slightly under weight, and the lingering scent of dust and sweat in the air. It was a place that had been ordinary in the morning, and yet by the end of the day it had transformed into a witness of courage, determination, and human resilience. Jed allowed himself a small, reflective smile. The platform would remain in the memory of the townsfolk, but it would also remain in his own memory as the place where he had tested his limits and discovered a deeper layer of his own strength. As he walked toward the outskirts of town, Jed thought about the people he had seen watching him. The children, the parents, the merchants, the performers. Each of them had witnessed the unfolding of courage in a form they may not have fully understood, yet they felt its presence. Some would speak of it for years, perhaps embellishing the details with each retelling. But Jed understood that the true value of the experience lay not in the retelling, not in the applause, but in the quiet personal realization that courage is cultivated through action, endurance, and the willingness to face fear directly. The first stars began to emerge in the twilight sky, small pinpoints of light in the vast expanse above the plains. Jed stopped for a moment, tilting his head back to take in the sight. There was a profound stillness in the night, a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos and excitement of earlier in the day. In that moment he felt a deep connection with the land, with the vastness of the plains and with the countless generations who had lived and worked under the same sky. Courage, he realized, was not just about heroic moments on a stage or platform. It was about how one moved through life, meeting challenges, enduring hardships, and rising to the demands placed by circumstance and by oneself. Jed thought back to the initial apprehension he had felt that morning, the doubt and the curiosity that had driven him toward the challenge. He remembered the moments of hesitation on the platform, the careful calculations of each step, and the awareness of every muscle in his body as he confronted the unknown. Those moments had tested more than his physical skill. They had tested his patience, his focus, and his ability to trust in himself. Now, with the task behind him, he could reflect on it with clarity. He had discovered a quiet resilience that had always been present but had been revealed fully only when he faced something truly unfamiliar. As he walked further from the town, Jed noticed the familiar scents of the plains, the sweet dryness of tall grasses, the faint aroma of distant pine and cottonwood, and the earthy scent of dust and soil. It reminded him of his home, of the ranch that had been his life for so many years, and of the countless challenges he had overcome there. The experience in town felt like an extension of that life, a test, a reflection, and a confirmation that he had lived well and learned the value of patience, courage, and perseverance. It was a lesson that he would carry with him always. Jed's mind also returned to the children he had seen leaning against the wooden railings, wide-eyed and inspired by what they had witnessed. He realized that courage could have a ripple effect, that one person facing their fear could inspire others to do the same in their own lives. The memory made him smile faintly. Perhaps in some small way his actions had planted seeds of bravery in those young minds, seeds that might grow over time into confidence, resilience, and determination. Courage, he thought, was not only personal. It could extend beyond oneself, touching others in ways both immediate and subtle. By the time he reached the edge of town, twilight had deepened into night. The streets were nearly empty, the shadows long and still. Jed paused for a moment on a small rise overlooking the town, taking in the scene. The platform now quiet, the buildings bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the wide open plains stretching endlessly beyond. He allowed himself a deep, steadying breath, feeling the lingering fatigue in his body, the ache of muscles tested, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had faced fear and uncertainty with integrity and determination. The day had been long, challenging, and exhausting, yet it had left him with a sense of accomplishment and insight that would stay with him forever. Jed's thoughts drifted to the future, to the simple life he would return to on the ranch. Yet he understood now that life's challenges could come in many forms, some familiar and some completely unexpected. He had learned that true courage was not limited to heroic acts or dramatic displays. It was woven into every choice, every moment of decision, and every encounter with fear or uncertainty. The experience in town had revealed this truth in a tangible, unforgettable way. As he continued walking under the starlit sky, Jed reflected on how the events of the day had reshaped his understanding of himself. He had always known he was capable, that his life on the ranch had forged resilience and strength, but this experience had shown him another dimension of courage, one that required vulnerability, awareness, and the ability to confront fear directly, even when others were watching. It was a quiet victory, a deeply personal achievement that would influence the way he approached life, challenges, and even his own self-doubt in the years to come. By the time Jed reached the edge of the plains, the night had grown darker, but the stars above offered a gentle, constant light. He paused once more, looking out over the open land that had been his life, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The challenge he had faced had tested him, taught him, and ultimately strengthened him. It had revealed lessons about patience, courage, vulnerability, and resilience, lessons that could not be measured in applause or recognition, but in the quiet understanding of what it means to be truly brave. Finally, as he mounted his horse and began the ride back to his ranch, Jed felt the lingering exhaustion in his limbs, the slow, deep fatigue that comes after a day of physical and emotional exertion. Yet he also felt a lightness, a sense of calm and fulfillment, and an awareness that he had discovered something lasting and valuable. The experience had not only tested his courage, but had illuminated the strength of his spirit, the depth of his determination, and the quiet power that comes from facing fear and uncertainty with steady resolve. As the horse's hooves made soft, rhythmic sounds on the dirt path leading home, Jed allowed himself to reflect on the lessons he had learned. Courage, he understood, was not a single moment of bravery, but a collection of small choices, of perseverance, and of facing fear directly. Vulnerability could be a strength. Patience was a necessity, and true resilience was revealed not in triumph alone, but in the act of continuing forward when the outcome was uncertain. These were lessons he would carry into every day on the ranch, in every decision he made and in every challenge that awaited him. By the time he reached the familiar fences of his ranch, the sky was a deep, star-filled black, and the land lay calm and silent under the night. Jed dismounted slowly, his body weary but his spirit uplifted. He walked among the cattle, checking on them quietly, appreciating the simple, steady rhythms of life that he had always known. Yet now, he carried with him a deeper understanding of courage, a quiet confidence in his own abilities, and the knowledge that he had faced the unknown, confronted his fears, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of his own strength.